In this example, we're going to use unit rates to solve application problems. Represent the following scenarios as unit rates in the indicated ways, then use this information to answer the corresponding questions. So, let's read the information. Stephanie can walk 5 miles in 2 hours. Use this information to fill in the chart below and use decimals when needed. So, let's take a look at this chart. The first row is representing hours. And notice we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we want to fill in the corresponding amount of miles. So we're given that in 2 hours she can walk 5 miles. So I'm going to fill that in. And we're making an assumption here, so this is her rate of speed, 5 miles in 2 hours, that she would be able to walk this speed at a constant rate no matter how many miles she walked, which probably isn't the case, but we're just going to say that she can walk this constant rate of speed. So now let's see what else we can fill in. So I'm looking at 4 hours. 4 hours is twice the amount of time as 2 hours, so she could walk twice the distance, which would be 10 miles. In 6 hours, well, we could think that's 2 hours more than 4 hours, so another 5 miles, which would be 15. Or you could think that's 3 times 2 hours, so 3 times 5 miles, which is 15. Now, how are we going to fill in the odd hours? Well, let's look at 1 hour. So 1 hour is half the amount of time of 2 hours, so she could travel half the distance of 5 miles, or 5 halves miles, which we can write as 2.5 miles. And notice this is actually going to be our unit rate of miles per hour, 1 hour, since this refers to the 1 hour. So now we know that going up any 1 hour will increase the number of miles by 2.5. So at 3 hours, it's 2.5 more than 5, which is 7.5. 4 hours would be another 2.5, which is 10, so that corresponds. 5 hours would be 2.5 more than 10, which is 12.5. So notice we used adding on 2.5 miles for every hour, and we can also connect this to multiplying. For 5 hours, it would be 5 times 1 hour, which would be 5 times 2.5 miles, or 12.5 miles. So now we're asked, what is Stephanie's unit rate of speed in miles per hour? And we already discussed this. We can see this from the first column. If we're thinking of miles, unit rate of miles per hour, it's going to be miles over 1 hour. And we can see that 2.5 miles corresponds to 1 hour. And our shorthand for this is 2.5. We'll write mph, which means miles per hour. And we determine this from the table by looking at the column for 1 hour. Now we're asked, using this unit rate of miles per hour, how far will Stephanie walk in 8 hours? Also write the corresponding proportion. So this isn't in our table, and we don't want to continue on the table, and in general you might not have a table going out to the number of hours. So let's think about this. In 8 hours, she'll walk 8 times as far as she did in 1 hour. Okay? So using the unit rate, I'm going to write 2.5, and I'm going to write this as miles over 1 hour instead of the shorthand, and you'll see why in a minute. So 8 hours, 8 times as many as 1 hour. And notice, just like before, I can see there's the unit of hour in a denominator and a numerator, so we can think of those as canceling out. And this tells me, I'll put this over 1, that my resulting unit will be miles, which is what I want. So I've set this up correctly. So that's just a good check. So 2.5 times 8 miles, and that will be 16 plus 4, which is 20 miles. The corresponding proportion, we'll start with our unit rate of 2.5 miles in 1 hour corresponds to 20 miles in 8 hours. Okay. Notice our multiplying factor from this rate to this rate is 8 times as much, and the ratios are equal. Now it asks to find the unit rate using the unit rate of miles per hour. How far will Stephanie walk in 3.75 hours? Also write the corresponding proportion. So 3.75 hours, that's not in our chart. It's between 3 and 4 miles, so we know it's going to be between 7.5 and 10 miles, closer to 10 miles. Okay. And we could cut these values into pieces using cut and copy, but let's just use our unit rate like we were asked to. So 2.5 miles in 1 hour. Now we want 3.75 times as many miles, for the 3.75 hours. I'll put this over 1 just to make the multiplication clear. Notice the hours cancel, and let's multiply this on the calculator. So we have 2.5 times 3.75, which is 9.375. And remember, our units left are miles. So in 3.75 hours, she can walk or jog. No, she's walking 9.375 miles. The corresponding proportion, be 2.5 miles, is to 1 hour, as 9.375 miles is to 3.75 hours. So again, these two ratios, they have different numbers, but they are equivalent. Let's look at the next question. What is Stephanie's unit rate of hours per mile? So this will tell us how many hours it will take her to walk 1 mile. So I wrote the information we had from before. It was 5 miles in 2 hours. So to write hours per mile, it would be 2 hours over 5 miles. And now remember, this is where we think of this as if I divided the numerator and denominator by 5, I would have 2/5 of an hour per 1 mile. Now I know this is messy. We have a fraction and a fraction, and I just made it messier. Let me fix that line. 2/5 hour. I'm going to write a really long fraction bar per 1 mile. Our shorthand for this will be 2/5 hours per mile. But I want you to be comfortable with this notation as well, because we like to use the rates written in this form to help us set up our multiplication to solve problems. Okay. So next we're asked, using the unit rate of hours per mile, how long will it take Stephanie to walk 20 miles, and write the corresponding proportion. Okay. So notice that this told us it takes her 2/5 of an hour to walk 1 mile. Now we want to know how many hours does it take her to walk 20 miles. Well, 20 miles is 20 times as large as 1, so we're going to need 20 times as large as 2/5 of an hour. But let's set this up like we did before. 2/5 hour to 1 mile multiplied by 20 miles. we can think of this as being over 1. Okay. Now notice, I'm checking to make sure this is set up correctly. The miles, we have a numerator and a denominator, so they cancel. And basically now we're just multiplying 2/5 times 20, and our unit left will be hours. Okay. So notice putting this 1 mile in the denominator, it helps you make sure you set your multiplication up correctly, but don't worry, you're not going to have to compute with it. So now let's multiply 2.5 times 20. Well, that's 40 over 5 hours, and 40 divided by 5 is 8. So it will take her 8 hours to walk 20 miles. Now let's write our proportion. 2 hours is to 5 miles, as 8 hours is to 20 miles. Okay. And notice I choose not to use this messy looking unit rate when I set up the proportion. It was nicer to have whole numbers. But notice there's not one corresponding proportion. There are many, and this is one way to write it that's a little bit more simple. And notice 20 miles is 4 times as large as 5 miles. 8 hours is 4 times as large as 2 hours. Now, using the unit rate of hours per mile, how long will it take Stephanie to walk 26.2 miles? So I think that's about the distance of a marathon. And yeah, she'd probably get tired, but we're going to say that she can still walk 2 hours and 5 miles. So we'll start with our 2/5 hours per 1 mile times 26.2 miles. I notice my units cancel, the miles. So now I want 2/5 times 26.2, and my units left are hours. And I'm going to do this on the calculator. So we'll change 2/5 to a decimal. It's 0.4, but I'm just going to do 2 divided by 5. I'll press equals. That gives me 0.4. And then I'll multiply that by 26.2, which is 10.48 hours. So it would take her about 10.5 hours to walk a marathon. Now let's write the corresponding proportion. Again, I'm going to use the 2 hours is to 5 miles, as 10.48 hours is to 26.2 miles. Okay. And the multiplying factor is a little bit more difficult here. Okay, but we'd multiply by about, what would be, 5.24 to get from this quantity to the next.